Now we'll talk about properties of multiplication, and these ideas are pretty easy, so we'll go through them fairly quickly. First, multiplying by 0. 2 times 0 is 0, and 128 times 0 is 0. In fact, anything multiplied by 0 is 0, and we can state this idea in general terms using a variable. We can say that a times 0 is equal to 0. And that's true for any number a. And if you wanted to, you could state it in reverse. You could say 0 times a equals 0. Either way, it means the same thing. Anything multiplied by 0 is 0. And this is true even if there are many factors. Look at this. A times b times c times 0 times d is going to end up being 0. If any of the factors is 0, then the answer is 0. So look at this next example. 217.3 times 129 times negative 98.74 times 0 times 2,318, that has to be 0. You don't have to start multiplying all these things together, which would be a whole lot of work to do. You just recognize that all 5 of these things are multiplied together, and one of them happens to be 0. It could be any of them. If any one of them or more, if any of them is 0, then the answer is 0. This concept has a name. It's called the multiplicative property of 0. And knowing that name isn't all that important. I've read a lot of math books at this point, and I don't know that I've ever heard that name referred to that way, or that concept referred to by name that way, or certainly not very often. The concept is important, though. If you don't remember the name, multiplicative property of 0, that's okay. But you should know completely that concept. And the idea is that if you multiply something by 0, you get 0. The concept is important. Knowing the name, that it's called the multiplicative property of 0, isn't as important as understanding the idea. Okay, let's also talk about multiplying by 1. This is also very easy. 5 times 1 is 5. 200,000 times 1 is 200,000. Negative 92 times 1 is negative 92. And we can state this idea in general terms. A times 1 is equal to a for any number a. So any number multiplied by 1 is just that same number. And this concept, again, very easy, but it also has a name. It's called the identity property of multiplication. And once again, that concept is what is the important thing. Knowing the name, the identity property of multiplication, isn't all that important, but knowing that multiplying something by 1 doesn't change it, that idea is important, and it's also pretty easy. We need to also understand multiplication by negative 1. This 3 times negative 2, this would be the same as having a negative 1 times 3 times 2. And you should be able to see that that's a negative 6. Notice that 3 times 2 gives me a 6, and this negative sign persists here to the answer. Negative 8 times 7 would be the same as negative 1 times 8 times 7. And we know that 8 times 7 is 56, and when we multiply by negative 1, we get negative 56. Again, we have a 8 times 7, that gives us our 56, and the negative 1 here shows up in the answer right there, negative 56. So a negative sign applied to one factor results in a negative sign applied to the answer. And as before, we can state this concept in general terms. I'm going to write negative a times b, that's going to be the same as negative a times b. Or we could also do this, a times negative b is equal to negative a times b. If there's a negative sign applied to one of the factors, then we end up with those two things multiplied together and a negative sign applied to the answer. But if the negative sign applies to two factors, this is here, it might be hard to see here, let me fill this in. That's a negative 3 times a negative 2, and this is negative 10 times negative 8. Okay, in this case, a negative 3 times a negative 2, that's going to be a positive 6. And a negative 10 times negative 8 will be a positive 80. So the two negative signs cancel each other out. And that's always the case if they're multiplied together. And we'll state this in general terms too. I'll say negative a times negative b is going to equal ab. There's no negative sign on the answer. Two negative signs multiplied together cancel each other out, and I'm just left with no negative sign on the answer. This idea shows up a lot when we're distributing. Look at these examples. Negative 5 times 6 minus x. Let's distribute here. The negative 5 times the 6 gives me a negative 30, and the negative 5 times the negative x gives me a plus 5x. So that's my answer, negative 30 plus 5x. And that would commonly be written like this, 5x minus 30. Let's do the next one. We're going to distribute the 6 across this negative a plus 2. So we're going to do 6 times negative a plus 6 times 2. So 6 times negative a is negative 6a. That's negative 6 times a. We have a single negative sign when we're multiplying those two things together, so we get a negative sign there. Then we have a plus, so I'll write plus, and then the 6 times 2 is 12. And that's my answer, negative 6a plus 12. In this third example, we have negative 2 times 4, which is negative 8. Then we have negative 2 times negative 3y, which is a positive 6y. This negative sign, when I multiply the negative 2 by this negative 3y, that negative sign canceled out with that one. I have the 2 times the 3, that gives me a 6, and it's positive, and I still have the y multiplied there. So 6y, negative 8 plus 6y. And again, we typically write the term with the variable first, so I would rewrite this as 6y minus 8. If you left your answer like this, that would be mathematically correct. That would still be equivalent to that. But it's just standard practice to put the variable first and then the constant term, the number, after that. Okay, what if we have three negative signs? Negative 2 times negative 5 times negative 6. Our answer in this case is going to be negative. And 2 times 5, let's do this. If this is hard to see on your screen, let me fill those in a little. This 2 times 5 is 10, and 10 times 6 is 60. And we can think of this as two negative signs canceling each other out. Remember, if we multiply two negative signs together, they cancel out. But that leaves us with this one here, which shows up in the answer. And you could think of these two as canceling out, and this one remaining, or you can think of these two as canceling out, and this one remaining. It doesn't matter. Just recognize that two of them cancel out, and a third one remains, so we get a negative sign on the answer. Or what if we have more than three negative signs? Well, negative 3 times negative 2 is going to be a positive 6. Those two negative signs will cancel out if we multiply them together. And these two negative signs canceled out will cancel out when multiplied together. So negative 1 times negative 4 is positive 4. So we can think of this as 6 times 4. The answer is 24, and it's positive. Or in this case, we have 5 negative signs multiplied together. So these two will cancel out, and those two will cancel out, and we have a negative number left. So our answer is going to be negative. So let's figure it out. 2 times 3 is 6. 2 times 5 is 10. So that's 6 times 10 is 60. And that times 6 is 360. So my answer is 360, and I remember that it's going to be negative because I have 5 negative signs. After a lot of those negative signs cancel out, I have one left. So we could say it like this. An even number of negative signs will cancel out. So if we multiply 4 negative numbers together, we get a positive answer. Or if we multiply 6 negative numbers together, we get a positive answer. An even number of negative signs will cancel out. An odd number of negative signs results in a negative sign, a negative sign applied to the answer. And that's because an even number of negative signs will cancel out. So if we have an odd number of negative signs, then all but one of them will always cancel out. And so we have a negative sign on the answer. And that's the case we had here. 5 negative signs multiplied together. 4 of these cancel out, and we're left with a negative sign that shows up on our answer.